The extent of the threat can only be known once we have the surveillance teams sort of up and running on the ground. And there are efforts underway already. The government of Uganda has been deploying the extension officers, the production officers on the ground in the different districts of Karamoja, which is where they've entered from, to be able to feed back information in terms of the type of locusts that have entered, the type of swarming activity, the density of the swarms, etc. All this information is very important for us to feed back, for example, to the headquarters of the Food and Agriculture Organization that houses currently the only global monitoring and early warning system for desert locust activity in the world. It is the Desert Locust Information Service, where they basically overlay information and reports coming in from the field, for example, from the surveillance teams set up along Karamoja, together with the satellite imagery and weather-related data to be able to say where the locusts may move further, and this can help us at least get an idea of the people and the livelihoods that may be a threat of the locust activity. In the region, the countries that are most affected are Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, as you well know. And there, across the three countries, we have about 12 million people that are currently severely food insecure. And they are at risk of losing or severe damage to their livelihoods. Reports are still being compiled in terms of the impact that this is having or may have on their livelihoods, and FAO is working with the national governments of these countries to try and assess the impact. In Uganda, on the other hand, in comparison, there are about, give or take, 300,000 people across the Karamoja and, let's say, Teso regions that are also severely food insecure. That's approximately about 10% of the population of these regions. So these are the people that we're looking at in terms of the maximum threat to their livelihoods that could be the most affected in terms of both their crops as well as forage and pasture to their livestock. What they can do to help the effort, the sort of common approach that you will find that farmers and communities will engage in is sort of beating drums and making a lot of noise and whistle blowing and maybe even lighting fires. But this does not have an effect on the desert locust. It does not kill the desert locust. And in fact, what government and FAO will be doing is trying to sensitize farmers and communities in these areas to inform the local agriculture production officers and the surveillance teams of the locust activity that they do see, because this information is then going to help the government and FAO to help determine the right technical response in terms of control operations, whether they're required and what kind of control operations will be required. So the best thing that farmers and communities can do is to be in touch with the surveillance teams and provide that information. And the other important thing, and this also will be information that will be provided by the government with the assistance of FAO, is once control operations are underway, to not consume the dead locusts that may have been treated by the pesticide, not to consume animals that may have in turn consumed those desert locusts, and for children not to play with desert locusts that they may see dead on the ground. We have a window of opportunity here, right? We're not in the planting season yet. This will happen sometime in March, depending upon the rains. So we are not at a point where crops have been devastated, where forage has been devastated. So the speed of the surveillance and the reporting and then eventual control measures that are put in place is going to be of the essence. So we have about a month, maybe a month and a half, where measures can be put in place, and this is sort of the window of opportunity that we are hoping to use. Saving forage, saving pasture is one way for the farmers to be saving seed for the planting season. Should the control measures that we put in place not be enough, and should the planting season sort of arrive and farmers start planting, and should there continue to be locust infestations, then the government as well as development partners such as FAO would have to look into assisting especially the most vulnerable farmers and herdsmen with fodder or feed for the animals, looking at treatment for the animals that may have been weakened by the lack of forage, as well as looking at seeds and planting materials and tools for the farmers to be able to replant should we come to that situation. But there's also a word of caution. We may put the control measures in place, we may put the surveillance measures in place now, and things may go well for the next month, month and a half. But the locusts are dangerous in terms of their reproductive ability and their migratory ability. And with every breeding season, they multiply 20-fold, and we are in a breeding season right now. It has already begun. They're not breeding in Uganda. We don't know if they will, but they are breeding in Ethiopia and in Somalia, and in possibly in Kenya as well. As they breed and they develop into the hoppers, then move along the ground and then take to the air, that continues to pose a threat to Uganda. There will be a second breeding season towards June. So we're looking at 2 breeding seasons between now and June. And although we may have surveillance and control activities in place now, what is important is that we do not let up with surveillance and with the data collection and with the monitoring and the reporting of locust activity in Uganda, but as well in Kenya, because whatever happens in Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia will continue to pose a threat to Uganda. So this is not going to be simply a 1 month or a very short-term effort. This is where Uganda needs to be on the alert and the lookout for at least the next 6 months or so. And of course, a lot will depend on what happens in the other 3 neighboring countries. The control operations have failed in Kenya. The reality is that they have been inadequate, and they continue to be inadequate. But not just in Kenya, in Ethiopia and Somalia, because remember, Kenya is being infested from Ethiopia and Somalia. So, I mean, all 3 countries need to have simultaneous operations at a particular scale going, and none of the 3 countries have reached anywhere they need to be in terms of the control operations because of a lack of funding. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization has been assisting all 3 countries with fundraising, with sort of helping them determine their needs and assisting in fundraising. And in January, FAO launched an appeal for about $70 million to help these 3 countries in mainly control operations, also some livelihood recovery, but the majority of these funds were for control operations. This appeal was revised last week. It's gone up to 76 million because now you have infestations in Djibouti and in Eritrea. There's breeding going on in Eritrea. Most likely this is going to be revised further upwards. The funds that have been mobilized to date are around 20% of what is needed. So you can imagine that 20% or less than what is required in terms of control operations are actually taking place in Kenya. So it's not that the control operations that are ongoing are ineffective or that the pesticides are not working, it's simply not enough and not fast enough. So they need more aircraft in the air, they need more pesticides, they need more people on the ground. And your question about pesticides, they are effective. If they are used in the right manner, they are applied in the right quantity, in the right way, at the right time, they can be very effective. They do not immediately kill the locust, so there is a little bit of a perception that they are not effective, or that maybe locusts are resistant to them because they are still seen to fly after the chemical pesticides have been applied, but that's because they die within a few hours of that, but they are effective. There are risks, but they're manageable risks, right? So these are pesticides that are very effective, that are approved for use. These are registered pesticides, yeah? These are not, for example, cancer-causing chemicals. That is a concern, and they are not that sort of chemical. The chemicals break down in the environment within 24 hours of having been applied. They're ultra-low volume pesticides, and they're applied in very small quantities. There is almost as much effort that is paid to the monitoring of spraying of pesticides as there is to the actual spraying, because this needs to be done only by well-trained teams. For example, you've got a lot of forces that the government of Uganda that the government has been deploying to Karamoja, but they're going to undertake the spraying and control operations only once they've been trained. Training, for example, begins tomorrow in Moroto. So the spraying activity actually only takes place by well-trained teams. They are not to be done by farmers, local communities, etc. There are very sort of specific health considerations. They look at the health aspect. They wear personal protective gear. So all of these considerations are taken into account during and after the spraying operations. Communities will be and are sensitized as to approaching or using or eating or consuming the desert locust, which they should not be doing. And the risks, if they are managed well, if it is the well-trained teams that are conducting the spraying according to the advice that is given to them, for example, by the international experts that FAO has been deploying to the region, to each one of these countries to help with these efforts, then the risks should be absolutely minimal. So there are a lot of variables, there are a lot of factors, so it is difficult to say whether it will be resolved in 5 to 10 days. I don't think it will be resolved. Measures will be put in place for the correct surveillance and for eventual control operations should it get to that stage. And hopefully, if things go well, the people that have been deployed by the government of Uganda should be able to undertake control operations towards the end of this week, early next week, depending upon how the training sessions go, and again, depending on the locust activity. But again, even if things do not develop into a very serious stage in Uganda at the moment, what is very important is over the next 4 to 6 months, at least until June, if not beyond, Uganda will need to continue to be on the alert and will continue to need to survey. So in that sense, it is still going to be a sort of a medium-term effort.